someone say no, see it on your face.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Don Winslow, and I am thrilled and delighted to be joined by best-selling crime writer Dervla McTiernan. Welcome, Dervla.
Thank you, Don. I'm so excited to be here with you. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we speak and by paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and in particular to extend that to any First Nations people who are joining us today.
Yeah, actually, Dervla, where I sit out in the country east of San Diego, California, is also Indigenous land originally, obviously. So let me join in paying my respects to the 𝘾𝙞𝙀 people here.
Wonderful.
So, okay, cool. Dervla, to start off with, I want to hear what you're doing in the build-up to publication of your new book. Tell us.
Oh my goodness, Don. Well, it's school holidays here, so we've been having really quiet family time at home, I think, before the chaos of the big tour kicks off. So a lot of quiet times, doing a lot of this sort of thing, Zoom things. I had a 3 a.m. Zoom with some UK book bloggers the night before last, which was really fun. So all that sort of stuff, keeping myself busy, writing a few little bits and pieces for magazines and newspapers as part of the promotional thing, which is a bit of a change of pace and has been kind of fun. But I think we share an Australian publication date, but am I right in thinking that City on Fire has already come out in the US?
No, you're wrong, Dervla.
Oh,
wrong. Right?
Got that wrong. That's not a good start.
No, it's fine. It's good. We get to talk about it. No, it comes out next week. It comes out next week.
So what
I feel like it's already come out, I'm sorry?
Yeah. What are you must be up to some of the same sort of thing? Are you doing a lot of
same sort of things, yeah, doing a lot of Zoom and it's all its cousins and kind of all over the world. And I have not been up at 3 a.m. with British bloggers, but I'm sure that's coming. And I have been writing, a lot of little articles, which is of course a change up. Because I think you and I are more sort of literary marathon runners than we are sprinters, So it's a bit different. So
do you enjoy writing for newspapers and magazines? Is that something you like?
I like doing a little bit of it.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd like to make a career of it. How about you?
Yeah, I'm the same. I struggle. I really do struggle with it. Every single time I have this moment where I'm going, why did I say I would do this? And then eventually, as I get into it, I enjoy it for a while, and I'm always relieved when it's done. Every single time, it's the same.
Yeah, and I like making stuff up, which apparently is frowned upon in journalism.
It's so reductive of people, really, this fact-based stuff. I mean, it's overrated.
And I don't know about you, but I spend almost all day, every day with people who don't actually exist, right? And they always say what I want them to say and do what I want them to do.
Yeah.
And this time of year, I spend more time with people who actually do exist, like yourself.
And it's challenging. I don't think people quite understand that as a writer, you spend most of your year like a little hermit. You're just yourself in your own small room and your imagination. And then at a certain point of the year, it's like, okay, no, it's on time. And then suddenly you have to be incredibly social in a really intense way for a very compressed period of time. And then they put you back in your little room again and say, now back to work. It's a weird life.
It is a strange life. And then, when they locked us down and told us to socially isolate, I couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah, it was the same, except that I had my husband was home and the kids were home, interrupting my very quiet, peaceful existence. Otherwise, it had very little difference.
Seeing my kids up and gone, and my wife doesn't want to hang out anyway. So that's not true. I'm joking. Okay, we should talk about the books, though.
Yes.
Okay. People get impatient with us, and I don't blame them. Dervla, could you tell us a little bit about how your background, fed into your passion for this book, The Murder Rule?
Well, in a way, there isn't a connection. I was a lawyer for a long time. I was a lawyer for about 12 years, but I was a commercial lawyer. So I wrote enormous contracts and negotiated contracts, that sort of thing. I certainly didn't do any criminal defense law. So in that sense, there's not much of a connection. But the seed of the story, I suppose what sparked my interest in it came from my background, in that I came across an article written about an Irish law student who went to the US for a summer on her J1 visa. And for those who aren't familiar, Irish university students have an opportunity to get what's called a J1 visa, which allows you to go to the US for the summer and work and earn some money. And we all did it. And we'd come home and pay our college tuition, and we'd work 3 or 4 jobs and have an absolute blast. That's sort of how you're supposed to balance things.
Right.
This young woman went to the States, and she, instead of working as a chambermaid or a waitress or whatever, like most of us did, she volunteered for the Innocence Project. And when she came home to Ireland, she couldn't quite let go of the case she'd been working. So she kept working it, kept making phone calls. And she tracked down a detective who had retired, who pointed her to some pitted evidence that had been hidden from the defense in this particular case. And as a result of her work, a man who'd spent more than 2 decades on death row was released from prison.
Wow.
It was unbelievable. But while the story was incredibly inspiring, and I couldn't help but contrast it with what I had spent I was a young Irish law student. I went to the States, but I went to Bar Harbor in Maine, and I worked as a waitress and a chambermaid, and I had a lot of fun, but I didn't do anything of any great meaning, So I had to it struck me the difference, but I wasn't really drawn to write about it until a couple of years later. I came across the article again. I did a little bit more digging into it. And it turned out that even after this young woman had found the evidence, it took another 5 years before the case was heard. And by the time that man was freed from prison, he'd been in prison for 22 years. He only had 3 years left to run on his sentence. And I couldn't help but think, why had this story been presented in the way it had been presented in all of the articles I'd originally read, which was this kind of bright, beautiful story of good triumphing over evil, when it actually was much more complex than that. And I thought, well, maybe the editor preferred the cleaner view, or maybe the Innocence Project had this sophisticated PR team that was pushing this prettier story. Not that I have any evidence to suggest that, but it did occur to me, which made me think, okay, what if you're a good person trying to do good things in a world that doesn't care? And the world we live in right now doesn't seem to care. Would you take a little step off the strictly ethical path to be effective? And if you did that, would you then take another little step off the path, and then again, and to how far would you go, and where does that line sit? Because it's very hard to be effective in the world today if you follow the rules strictly. So I was trying to find, well, where is that line, and when do you cross over it, and would you know? And that was interesting to me. I felt like there could be a story there.
That's fascinating, Dervla. Do you think that there's sort of an ethical equivalent, because that the prosecution and the police probably did some unethical things? And do you think, well, if they went this far, I can go this far, but I can't go that far unless they went that far? Do you see that sort of equation?
It's an arms race. I think it's absolutely the case. And I think what happens is that the risk, when we lose our professionalism and we become tribal, you become more convinced that you're right. And if you're absolutely sure that you are right, then you can justify almost anything. And I think that's what happens a lot of times with police, and you would know this far better than I would, Don. But I mean, I think what does tend to happen is people only hear their own point of view echoed in the people around them, and you become more and more entrenched, and then you can start to justify all sorts of things. But that actually does happen on both sides of the fence. Just historically, it's been more on the policing side of things, but I think that it does happen in both sides.
Yeah, I've known police who did not bend the rules and spent the rest of their lives regretting it.
Yeah.
I knew a guy who could have gone in and faked some stuff to arrest somebody and didn't do it. And then the next week went back because the wife had been murdered, And so it's a strange ethical world that way. And there are very few clean lines, really.
Well, that's what interests me, because there aren't any clean lines. And where, I think that's where you find the story, where people are really living as opposed to where we think they might be. But can I ask you, with City on Fire, that's a very personal book for you. Am I right in thinking that?
You are. Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's the first time I've gone home in a literary sense. I left this little New England East Coast fishing village when I was 17 and wandered the world, Africa and Europe, Asia, ended up out here in California, and finally decided to write a book set at home. So yeah, it's personal.
Why did you feel ready to write it now? As opposed to if you'd written it 20 years ago, would it be the same book?
No, I don't think it would be as good a book. because in all candor, I don't think I was sort of mentally or emotionally ready
Mm,
to go home in
mm,
that sense. You know, my wife and I started to go home to take care of my mom, who was in her declining years. And we kept going back for longer and longer periods of time as need, you know, dictated. And as a lot of people have experienced, that's not particularly fun.
mm.
Uh, but during those times, I started to rediscover my love of the place. You know, I left there because there was no opportunity for me. It was sort of a Bruce Springsteen, if you will, kind of the town, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, but I started to develop this sort of deep love and excitement about the place. And so I finally decided to write this book, the idea for which I had almost 30 years ago.
It's an absolutely fabulous book. But I have
Oh,
to say, as you tell me that you've developed a great affection for that place, I'm not sure I've seen it anymore. It feels like the last gasp of a society, you know?
yeah, listen, I think that societies in decline are more interesting to write about.
Yeah,
Cultures that are either on the way up or on the way out, to me, are more interesting to write about than in their heyday, you
yeah,
know? Yeah.
yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's a crime novel, you
Yes.
know? And
Mhm.
so which leads me to my next question for you. What do you love about the crime genre? Why this? Why not
Oh,
something
it's
else?
such a tricky question to answer, if I'm really honest. I mean, I grew up in a family with two very hardworking parents, and three brothers and three sisters. So there wasn't a whole lot of time, and nobody had any idea what I was reading. I mean, people just, it wasn't like that. These days, we try to curate our children's libraries. Nobody did that when I was a
No,
kid, you know.
not with me either.
I would pick up whatever my brothers left behind, often with the cover missing, and they read a lot of science fiction with
Huh.
a sprinkling of fantasy. And when I first started to get paid babysitting jobs, which is when I was 11, because that's the way it worked in those days, I
Yeah.
would get paid £5 to babysit, and that was enough to buy a paperback. So I could get my own books. And it was mostly fantasy in the early years. And then at a certain point, I just stopped being able to find authors that I could fall in love with the same way. I still loved the breadth of the story and how extreme the stakes were and the characters, but they weren't doing the same things they had done. And I realized my taste had changed, or I'm not sure exactly what it was, but what I was bringing home more and more was crime fiction. And I think it's because, well, look, the first thing is because I think most crime writers recognize that their first duty is to entertain. You know,
Mhm.
most people come to fiction for entertainment. They come for other things too, but firstly for entertainment. And I think that's an obligation most of us take pretty seriously. But then also the breadth of the genre, there's almost no limit to it. You know, you can tell any story, any style of story, any location, and the quality of the writing right now is amazing and has been for a long time. So I think it's all of those things. What about for you, Don?
Yeah, very, very similar. You know, my parents let us read anything we wanted to at any age.
Mm.
I have one sibling, and also a novelist. You know, so
Really?
two kids in the family both ended up being professional writers. But yeah, I agree with you. You know, our first responsibility is to entertain and write. You know, I think good suspenseful books and write them well. I love the crime genre because it gives us a chance to look at humanity in extremis.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
we see the very best and the very worst. We see people in extraordinarily difficult situations, and how do they deal with it, and the sort of ethical conundrum that you were discussing earlier. You know, so I think that's what I love about the genre, and also I share with you the quality of the writing.
yes,
You know, sometimes I'll sit and read Raymond Chandler out loud to myself, you know, and I just
amazing.
hear that poetry of the streets and the kind of, you know, symphony of the night, that I really adore. Mr. Springsteen, you know, wrote a song called "Darkness at the Edge of Town." And I think that's where we kind of live. At least it's where I
Yeah,
like to live, you know, in the
yeah.
darkness on the edge of town. Hey, Dervla, I'm going to read to you from your blurb.
Oh,
Okay.
oh God. Okay.
Oh God. And then get you to comment on it.
Okay. All right.
All
Sounds
right.
good.
Okay. So they think I'm a young idealistic law student, that I'm passionate about reforming a corrupt and brutal system. Tell me more about who this is, who's speaking, who's this young character.
Well, this is Hannah Oakby, And Hannah is, well, she appears to be a young idealistic law student. She joins the Innocence Project on the eve of their biggest case. They're trying to save an innocent man from death row. And, she looks like what you'd expect her to be. She looks like this attractive, clever, bright, but young, eager to please, almost on the line with being naive. It's the reality is, of course, Hannah's a very different person. You scrape the surface, she's darker, she's more complicated, and she's got her own agenda. And really, Hannah was the person I wanted to write this book for, because I think she was a little bit of wish fulfillment for me in a way, because when I was a young lawyer, I was a box ticker. I was the eager to please, do everything right young person, which is a very boring way to live your life. And it took me a long time to grow out of it. And I think it wasn't an unreasonable reaction to the culture I grew up in, which had a set of expectations for young women. And I just tried really hard to fulfill them. But it sounds a little cheesy, but I'm so inspired by young women today, and particularly young female artists who just do what they want, who are very clear that they are in charge of their own destiny. I remember watching Lady Gaga on Carpool Karaoke. I don't know if you've ever seen that, Don, with James Corden. So funny. No. It's on YouTube, and the setup is that James Corden drives a car around and pretends to take people in the carpool, and there's a bit of singing and a bit of back and forth. And he's talking to Lady Gaga, and he turns to her at one point and he says, he sort of imitates someone who's working with her, and sort of says, look, if your collaborators hear some of your more obscure lyrics sometimes, do they give you a face? Huh? And she just says, well, James, first of all, they don't get to do that because I'm the boss. And she said it so beautifully. And it was so inspiring. And I just thought, oh my God, amazing. So I think there's been a real change. I'm in my 40s now, between me, my age group, and women in their 20s. And for me, I just really wanted to write a young woman who, whatever she might appear to be on the surface, she knows who she is. She believes in her own abilities, and she doesn't see any reason not to take action. Now, whether or not she's right remains to be seen. And she might learn some hard lessons along the way. But her starting point is that she trusts herself and makes her own decisions, as opposed to waiting to take in the feedback of others and be led by that. And I just really wanted to write a character like that.
Yeah, and clearly that's part of you, because as a writer, you make your own decisions, don't you?
I do now. It just took me a bit longer than it takes others to get there. Well, let me ask about City on Fire. I've got a kind of a personal question for you.
All right.
So, I know, trouble. The reviews for the book are absolutely stellar. I mean, they're just extraordinary. And it's not just this book. I mean, you could look at Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, LA Times, New York Times, Times in the UK. I mean, there's not a paper of record, I would think, that has not given one of your books at least a rave review, if not all of them. And Stephen King has called you one of America's greatest storytellers, which I absolutely agree with, by the way. And he's not alone. I mean, many of the greatest writers that we have would list you first. Can I ask you this, Don? We've seen and we know there are a lot of people who have had extraordinary success and great talent. And as their careers progress, they kind of go off kilter a little bit because it changes them. And that sort of feedback changes them. And you don't appear to have had that happen to you. How do you stay yourself? How do you process that sort of feedback and praise?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's very, very nice of you to say. I look, when someone like Stephen King says that, I'm blushing, right? You know what I mean? I'm like, yeah, very nice of him to say, but I don't know that I agree. Listen, I'm part of our genre, yeah, that I'm so proud of. And there's so many wonderful writers in it, as you alluded to. We come from a great tradition, and we live in a great neighborhood. And so as I read writers from our past and I read contemporary writers, that will keep you humble,
There's some great writers out there.
Yeah, you read someone who writes this fantastic sentence and you think, I'm not that good, I'm maybe okay, and also look, I'm so grateful for this career. I was an overnight success at 55. It was kind of an Arctic night. And so I have far more experience of not making them than making it.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't take a long memory
Yeah. Yeah.
for me to look back at when people were not saying those things,
Yeah.
you know, and so it's pretty easy to stay grounded. And also, you've not met my wife. I hope you do. When we buy our mutual property on the
Yes.
beach,
I look
and
forward to that.
and she'll keep you humble pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
Well, you
Yeah.
need that very badly. I often say when you go on tour, it's a weird world. People are very, very nice to you usually, and you're staying in lovely hotels, and that's all great. And then I come in the door and it's like, Mom, where are my socks? Mom, can I
Right,
have toast? And it's
exactly.
like, boom, bam.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you just came back from a tour, you know, and
Yeah.
here's the laundry and
Yeah,
good luck.
exactly.
Yeah,
100%. That is exactly what it's like.
that's exactly it, you know. Listen, so your book, and I loved it, by the way, you know,
Oh, thank you, Don.
obviously. It deals with, as you alluded to, tough subjects,
Mm.
capital punishment, death row. How did you navigate that?
Well, when it comes to capital punishment, in all honesty, I guess I didn't deal with it too directly, because by the time Hannah joins the team, the chances of the defendant, Michael Dandridge, being put to death are significantly reduced. That's not really what's at stake at that stage. Or, you know, he's in prison and they're trying to get him out, but that's less of a risk. I suppose the only way I dealt with it was a bit indirectly, because I did deal with the injustice that is at the heart of the legal system, and the fact that, so the Innocence Project had great success in its early years in freeing people with the use of DNA. When DNA testing first became available, they were able to prove without a shadow of a doubt that many people who were in these situations were entirely innocent. And then they had to look for other methods where they would have the same impact. So they looked at junk science, essentially. And so it was very interesting to do some of the research on that area, because I mean, some of the stuff is just so extreme. Arson was a big area, and the Innocence Project has used this one a lot. But you had expert witnesses going into court.
Oh,
I'm going to ask you about this one, because I know you've had experience in court as
yeah.
an expert witness. But they go into court and say, you know, this particular burn pattern indicates without any doubt that kerosene was laid in a line here deliberately, and this means it's all nonsense, just made up. Same with bite evidence. You know, these teeth marks would indicate this person. It's like a fingerprint. It's not like a fingerprint, but if you stand up with enough authority in court and say this, people will believe you. And I hope that by exposing some of that, you know, what I've shown is that, look, wherever you sit on the morality of capital punishment, if you recognize that our justice system was made by humans and is operated by humans, with all that comes with that, corruption, incompetence, you know, simple human error, I would hope that we would agree we're not in a position where we can be choosing to put people to death when we just simply don't know how many things we've gotten wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, there are people from cases that I've worked that I'd probably like to kill, you know, in all candor.
Of course, yeah.
And yet, you know, human error being what it is, we don't have that right, because it's an irredeemable mistake.
Yes, I completely agree. And I have
Can't take
absolutely
that.
every sympathy for people who have been bereaved in horrendous circumstances.
Mhm.
I get the urge, like who wouldn't feel that way? But that's why that person isn't shouldn't be in the position to make the final decision, because we do get stuff wrong. And, you know, we're in the moment, we're convinced we're right, but
Yeah, and what we're dealing with in what I've referred to as the CSI era, where juries have been educated on television to think that there's always positive, determinative forensic evidence, and they totally expect it. And if you can't give it to them, which you can't in many cases, or some expert comes in and speaks expertly and gives it to them,
authority.
you know, it's
It's
too
incredibly
risky, too
convincing,
tricky.
and we think we overestimate the degree to which we're logical as humans as well, you know, and we think that we make, you know, witnesses are very convinced of the veracity of the evidence that they give, eyewitnesses, but they're often wrong. And then, I mean, one of the stats that really kind of threw me is, of all of the people who have been proven to be innocent through the use of DNA, 1 in 4 had confessed to the crime. I mean, what does that say about the vulnerability of people in police custody? That's crazy. I mean, that's a huge statistic.
Yeah, I worked for a woman who confessed in the following fashion. The cop actually turned the recorder off and talked to her for a while, and then turned it back on. You know, we found the gap in the tape, right? And he said, isn't it possible that you did this and it was so traumatic, you forgot that you did it? And she said, I suppose that's possible. And they arrested her on that basis and charged her. You know, it's
Yeah.
mind-boggling.
Yeah, it
It's
is absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
like to come back to City on Fire for a moment, if I might, because I don't think we have talked about it half enough. And
Oh,
would you
I do.
mind? Never. Could you describe the book to us? Would you mind?
Yeah, the elevator pitch, I guess.
Yes, please. The elevator pitch.
Going up. It's a first of a trilogy, for one thing, and it features a protagonist named Danny Ryan, who's a minor player in the Irish mob in New England. And because of loyalty to his family and his friends, he ends up fighting in a war against the Italian-American syndicate, and things escalate from that. And we will eventually follow Danny from New England to Hollywood to Las Vegas. Ding. Okay, so turnabout
awesome. Oh no, I've done my pitch already.
No, turnabout being fair play.
No,
McTiernan, I have you on the stand now.
My very casual description of the book will be exposed earlier as having been very practiced, because it is actually my elevator pitch.
So have you talked about this book before in any other interview? No. Give us the elevator pitch, Dervla. You're not getting off that easy.
Well, it is what I've said before. My elevator pitch is all around Hannah. So this is how I do it, right? The ding will begin. I say, the story follows Hannah Oakby, who's a young idealistic law student. She joins the Innocence Project on the eve of their biggest case, and they're trying to save an innocent man from death row. And Hannah appears to be, bright-eyed, idealistic, keen to change the world, but she's not that person. When you scrape beneath the surface, she is very different. She's more complicated, she's darker, and she has an agenda of her own. You see, you might have heard those words before, Don.
No, but they bear repeating. And if people want to buy The Murder Rule, which I'm sure they do now.
Yes, absolutely. And well,
how do they do that?
Well, we're on Booktopia right now, so we're going to say Booktopia for sure. So you can order on Booktopia, and it will be in all good bookshops in due course.
Great. Yeah.
And the same for City on Fire?
I think same with City on Fire. You get it through Booktopia, and there we go.
It seems to me, obviously, well, I think it's evident to anybody who reads your books that loyalty and code and honor are at the heart of what you write about. Mm-hmm. What is it about those themes that brings you back? What pulls you back in to write about those?
I think that those are themes I grew up with. I grew up around that world. I've known the characters in my books since I was a kid, in this book since I was a child, and that was always instilled in you as the code. You stand by your own, you don't snitch, you're loyal to the death. So when I come across a Danny Ryan, I completely understand that even in the criminal sense of that code, that's the code you live by. Now that's more of an ideal than a reality. We know that almost every mobster ever has been a rat.
Yeah.
Eventually, and the only ones who aren't are the ones at the very top, because they don't have anyone to rat on. And that's the only reason that they don't. Yeah. So, I still think, that loyalty is one of the prime human virtues. Yes. And I don't know that I can ever shake that. Yeah,
no, I 100% agree with that. I read your book again last night for the second time. No, it was absolutely brilliant on the second reading. But it occurred to me while I was reading it, you might be one of the best writers for a new writer to read for inspiration, but I don't know that you are for emulation, because you do what very sophisticated writers do. You play with point of view. This is a real writer's question, but I'm going to be selfish and ask one for me now. Yeah. You play with point of view within, not just within the chapter, but within the paragraph, almost within the sentence sometimes. And it's so fun. But I mean, that takes real skill. Is that something that you're conscious of doing, or do you
It is.
Really?
Yeah, it is. Well, years ago I was conscious of it. Now I think it's probably unconscious.
Yeah.
But years ago I was writing a book called Savages at a fairly down time in my career, and I was sort of angry at everybody and angry at the industry, but I was angry at everyone making up rules. And I said, I'll switch point of view inside a sentence if I feel like it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, it's like juggling. If you drop the balls, it's a bad act.
Yeah.
Right. And you're wrong and you're bad. But if you don't drop the ball,
Then
it's a good act.
exactly.
You know, and so I like playing around with that. You
Yeah.
know, listen, I think sometimes we underestimate our readers' intelligence.
Mm.
You know,
Completely
well,
agree.
the reader can't stay with you. Yeah,
Of course they
yes,
can
she
stay
can.
with us. Yeah.
Of course they can
Yeah.
stay with us.
But only
Yeah.
when you do it very, very well. And I'm sorry to be so complimentary because I know it's uncomfortable, but there's nothing like it's I feel like that writing sits in two places. One with, you know, a beginning writer who doesn't understand that they're losing their point of view, and that's hard to read because you can't stay with that. And the other is the other level, which is you and a few other writers I know who just play with it, and it's a joy, and it's like a symphony, you know. I'm sorry to be so cheesy, but that's how it feels to me. And I think I'm staying safe somewhere in the middle at the moment, but I'd like to get there. So it's really inspiring. It's such brilliant writing.
Well, let's keep on with this mutual admiration society.
Let's do it. I think it must be lovely for everybody
It's
watching.
fun, and we need it after the day we've had. Your characters are so beautifully developed.
Oh, thank you, Don.
No, it's the truth. So what's that all about? How do you get them there?
I just spend a lot of time with them, I suppose. It's always character for me, and it always has been. You know, when I was a kid sitting up in the room that I shared with my sister, and it was such a good reading room because the sun would come in the afternoon on the bed, and I could lie there for hours reading and nobody kind of paid attention. And I would sink into the stories, you know, and just wake up almost blinking 4 hours later, coming back into the real world. And it was always about the characters, going back in to those stories and spending time with the characters that I loved. And I would reread and reread and reread the books I loved again and again. So when I'm trying to write something, I have to start with a character that I feel really strongly about, that I have a really strong emotional response to. And if I have that, I know I've got a starting point. But a clever idea without that sort of resonance with a character, there's nothing to work with. So I start with that character, and then I just sort of start digging down, and I usually kind of know them pretty well from the beginning, but I don't necessarily know how they got there. And then the process of figuring out, well, how does a person like this come into being? Then I find the story, you know, because you learn about their family, and you learn about their friends, and you learn about their background, their education, and how they've spent their life up to that point, and all the things that made them. How about you? How do you approach character?
You know, I agree with you. I've always felt that unless the reader cares about the character, they're not going to care about what happens to the character. You can construct the most brilliant plot and story, but if we don't care about the people in it, so what?
Yeah.
You know, so I spend a lot of time on character. I won't start to write a book until the characters start talking to me.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds nuts.
No,
right?
I get it.
That sounds crazy, but you know, I wouldn't start this book until Danny Ryan started talking to me, until I heard his voice and what he was saying and what he was thinking, you know, and then I start to type. But I want to know, what were those books you were reading by that window that you loved and you went back to again and again?
It's terrible to say this, but I'm always a little bit embarrassed because when I hear other people speaking about their reading history, and it's always the classics or crime classics, or, you know, books that have become classics over the years, even if they weren't when they were read. Whereas I really didn't read those books, and I read fantasy. And I mean, some of my favorite books when I was a kid were the Dragonlance books, which were books written by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman and based around you know, Dungeons and Dragons, and that's where they came from, role-playing games. My God, I love those books. And there's a character, Sturm, who dies in one of them, and I cried every time I read that chapter. I mean, not just like a few tears. I mean, I wept like it was a family member for hours. And then the second time I read it, the same, and all the way through. And then later, Robin Hobb was someone I hugely admired. I think she's a fabulous writer, and so many others. So I still have them, all the times we've moved house, and the various boxes of books that I've sometimes had to shed along the way. When I unpack my bookshelves, I still have my Anne McCaffrey's and my Dragonlance books and my Terry Pratchett's and my everything else. Those are the ones I can't let go of, you know.
That's great. That's great. I want to mention, I'm thrilled to mention that The Murder Rule is the book of May, for the month of May for Booktopia.
Exciting.
And I'm pleased to be here for City on Fire. And I think that it's time, I'm afraid, for us to say goodnight, or in my case, good morning in yours, or wherever it is. Hey, Dervla, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
An absolute pleasure talking to you too, Don. I could sit here all day if I didn't have to do jobs, unfortunately.
Right, yeah. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, again, get a copy of our latest books, please. Mine is called City on Fire, the wonderful Dervla McTiernan, it's The Murder Rule, and you can get a description of it right now on booktopia.com. And thanks for watching,
Thank you
everybody.
all for joining us. Thanks, guys.
And see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Dervla.
Something say now, see it on your face.